Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Ellen?
Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the briefing on evaluation of response to intervention practices for elementary school reading. I'm Ellen Schiller at RtI. I focused on policy and practice research in special ed, and with a particular focus on improving reading outcomes for more than 30 years. I'm joined by my MDRC colleagues and expert advisors. Rekha.
Hi, I'm Rekha Balu. I'll be discussing the study findings today. Here at MDRC, I work in our K-12 policy area on a number of projects relating to data-driven decision-making and early grade reading.
And our expert advisors are Carol Connor and Russell Gersten, who you'll hear from in just a few moments. So what we're going to do is just review the context for the study, the findings, and then we're fortunate to have Carol and Russell join us for some comments with implications for practice. And I think that as we go through the session, if you would like to write in questions in the chat box, that would be terrific. We will address them at the end of the conversation, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, and just a reminder for those who just joined, if you have problems with anything related to WebEx, seeing the slides, hearing the audio, you can email us at rtiproject@mdrc.org, and someone will troubleshoot for you. So let's begin.
So why study RTI practices? There have been multiple efforts, federal, national, and local initiatives that contribute to why it's important to study RTI practices. There have been advances in research on the use and advantages of universal screening for identifying children at risk of reading difficulties, and really supports the foundation of an RTI framework, as has the research on monitoring student progress. There's growing interest in school accountability systems, and there's the wide availability of tools to screen and measure progress. So the use of database decision-making to determine appropriate support for students is ripe for an opportunity to study how schools are addressing, including that practice as part of their framework. In the school year 08-09, when this study began its planning, 70% of districts with elementary schools reported using RTI in language arts. Yet no systematic effort or study had identified the prevalence of RTI practices as used by schools. And so this study examines the prevalence of RTI practices in schools. And while earlier studies had examined the effectiveness of Tier 2 interventions, particularly in grade 1, this is the first study to examine how RTI is implemented in the real world and at a large scale. And the study is the first to describe the RTI practices used by elementary schools. The study actually determines whether or not schools' Tier 2 reading intervention programs help such students perform better than similar students not receiving interventions. So the focus is on schools, their decisions for identifying children who are appropriate for the intervention, and then evaluating the effectiveness of that decision rule around the cut point for determining the effectiveness of their approach. And finally, IDA 2004, of course, reauthorized funding for early intervention services, and allows for funding to be used for students not yet identified for special education. And this information contributes to determining whether the student has been responsive or not to evidence-based practice. So if we're going to study RTI practices, what are the RTI practices that were studied? And we pulled the practices, the key features from the prior literature. These will not be a surprise to most of you. The first is that the schools needed to demonstrate that there are multiple tiers with increasing intensity of support, and that all students receive the core reading services, and as we understand RtI, there would be fewer students receiving Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions. Secondly, schools needed to allocate staff to provide tiered support. That means classroom teachers offer core reading services to all students, plus small group instruction. And secondly, that there are intervention services offered outside of the core reading block for students who are reading below grade level. And then lastly, the schools needed to demonstrate that they collect and use data to make instructional and intervention decisions throughout the year, including screening all students at least twice a year. The study includes 3 research areas. 1, we compare practices between 2 school samples, a reference sample and an impact sample, which I'll explain in just a moment. We also compare reading services between reading groups at different skill levels. If RtI is about providing reading intervention services, how can we describe those in a way that's meaningful to practice? And finally, we examine the impacts on reading outcomes of students who fell just below the school-determined eligibility for intervention services. And just as a reminder, this study was conducted during the 2011-12 school year, so the service delivery and outcome data reflect the 2011-12 school year. So the study sample is from 13 states. We actually had nominations from over 500 schools in 23 states that were screened. And this is what we're referring to as the impact sample. And from those 500 schools, we further screened them and observed their use of these key practices, and they needed to have implemented these key practices for at least 3 years. And finally, we also examined the extent to which they used their decision rules for determining whether or not students receive an intervention or not. So we confirmed their decision rules, and that also determined their eligibility for the study. And through that process, we identified an impact sample of 146 experienced schools. And as the note says, and they implemented these practices for at least 3 years and used these key practices, including the threshold scores on screening tests to assign students to tiers. In addition, we had a reference sample. This was 100 schools randomly sampled from each state, and this was to compare the impact sample school to schools in their states that would represent routine practice. And now we'll turn it over to Leica.
Hi. So I'll be describing the findings that correspond to these 3 research areas that Ellen mentioned. So first, we're going to discuss results at the school level with this comparison between the school samples. Then I'll show you results at the reading group level, where we compare services provided to groups at different reading skill levels. And then we'll show you results at the student level that pertain to our impact analysis. So off the bat, we can tell you that there's a higher proportion of impact sample than reference sample schools that use key practices. So we asked about 8 key practices corresponding to the 3 areas that Ellen mentioned at the beginning: database decision-making, staffing, and the use of multiple tiers. And in this set of 8 practices, the ones that are bolded here indicate the ones where the differences between the school samples were significantly different. And what you can see is in each of the 3 feature areas of database decision-making, staffing, and use of multiple tiers, we have results that are significantly different, where, not surprisingly, the schools in our, quote, impact analysis sample who we had screened for having key RtI practices are demonstrating a higher use of them, such as providing intervention for Tier 2 students 3 times a week, which is something that has come up in practice guides in prior literature. In addition, you see that having specialized reading staff available to assist teachers, a higher proportion of this impact analysis sample set of schools are reporting the availability of that staff compared to our reference sample. And having a designated set of steps for making decisions to help struggling students, you can see the vast majority of the impact analysis schools report having that practice. But you also see a fairly high proportion of the reference school sample also reporting having such steps in place. So our takeaway from this is the prevalence of RtI practices is high, but a higher proportion of the impact sample school has these is implementing these practices. The other thing we wanted to verify was whether schools were actually following this idea of the multiple tiers of having the majority of their students in Tier 1 and increasingly fewer students in Tiers 2 and 3. And indeed, we find that the majority of students are placed in Tier 1. This left-hand bar shows the organization of student placements in the fall of 2011 based on fall screening assessment data, and the right-hand bar shows what that distribution looked like in the winter. And you can see that the overall distribution of students remains relatively similar between fall and winter, and that 60% or more of students are in Tier 1. And for those of you who are familiar with RtI being shown as a pyramid, this essentially verifies that that bottom of the pyramid is fairly broad. And so this said to us that there is distinction in identification of students, and that there may be differences then in the services that are delivered to students who are receiving services at different tiers of intensity. And indeed, we found, when we examined this, that the service intensity differed between the student reading levels in the impact sample schools. And we compared students reading below grade level to students in groups that were reading at or above grade level. And we looked at this on a few commonly measured dimensions. So in terms of minutes per week of instruction, the size of the group, the content, reading skills addressed, and the use of specialized staff, we found that there were more minutes per week provided to students in groups reading below grade level as compared to those students in groups reading at or above. The group size was smaller for the groups reading below grade level, and those groups reading below grade level tended to focus more on phonics and less on vocabulary as compared to the groups reading at or above grade level, and more specialized staff rather than classroom teachers or paraprofessionals were serving those groups reading below grade level. If I could just ask that for folks who are not speaking, if you don't mind muting your computer or muting your phone during the presentation portion, that would be great, and then we can turn things back on during the Q&A. Thanks so much. So in particular, we wanted to look at the amount of time that was provided to groups reading below versus at or above grade level. And this focus on reading groups is really something that we felt was important because this is the kind of the mode in which many of these intervention services are delivered within an RtI framework. And so we found that there was more weekly time for groups reading below versus at or above grade level, but intervention services were provided to more reading levels than would be expected. So for example, in this left-hand set of bars, you see that small group instruction, those additional services that are provided during the core reading block, there's more time of small group instruction provided to those students reading below, in groups reading below grade level than in groups reading above. And as one might have expected, intervention services are provided only to students in groups reading below grade level, and there is no intervention service provided to those reading above. However, we found this unexpected set of schools where intervention services were being provided not only to groups reading below grade level, but also to groups reading above, as shown in these white bars. And so even though for small group instruction, that amount of the time and services that are provided during the core reading block, we saw some differentiation between the groups reading below and above grade level. When it came to intervention time, there was no statistically significant difference. And so this raised a question for us about then what is the extent of the contrast in services in these schools that we call all level schools, because at least some reading groups at each of the reading levels below and above were receiving some intervention services. And this variation in how schools organize the intervention services for specific reading levels potentially lessens that contrast. So when at or above reading groups are receiving interventions in some schools, this meant in grade 1, up to 45% of impact sample schools were providing intervention services to at least some students who read at or above grade level, rather than what a traditional model might have said, suggested as intervention services being provided just to those who read below grade level. And the other major variation that we found was that interventions were occurring both during and outside of the core reading block. As an example of that, in grade 1, 67% of schools provided at least some intervention during the core reading block time, rather than intervention time being a supplement to that 90-minute reading block that we found the majority of our impact sample schools implementing. And so this meant that in combination, only about 16% of schools were operating what might be called a textbook RtI model of providing intervention services only to below grade level readers and only outside of the core reading block. So we then decided, and so this was informing our view of the impact analysis. And for the impact analysis, we wanted to verify whether schools were actually following the decision rules in terms of what they used to assign students to tiers 2 or 3. Even though students above grade level were receiving some intervention services, were students at least being correctly identified according to their decision rule? And in fact, we find that that is the case. The takeaway from here is, if you think about this line at 0 as representing whatever the cutoff score was or whatever the decision rule was that a school used to determine whether a student is eligible for tiers 2 or 3, those who fell below that benchmark should be receiving intervention services, meaning being assigned to tiers 2 or 3, and indeed that's what we find the majority of students are. And those students who score above that threshold score are, for the most part, being assigned to tier 1 and not to tiers 2 or 3. So with this knowledge that schools were at least following their decision rules and assigning students as they'd expected, we went to examine the impact of being assigned to intervention services on reading outcomes that were relevant for each of the 3 grades that we looked at, grades 1, 2, and 3. And what we found was that there were no positive impacts of being assigned to receive intervention for those students near the eligibility threshold. So if we go back to this, we want to be clear that this y-axis here is just about the proportion of students assigned to tier 2 or 3 intervention services, whereas this graph is about the impact estimate on the particular reading outcomes that we examined for each grade. So in grade 1, we looked at the Eccles-K reading assessment as a comprehensive reading measure, and Tower 2 as a measure of reading fluency. What we found was a negative impact of negative 0.17 in standard deviation units, which is equivalent to 1/10 of a year less of learning. For the reading fluency measure in grade 1, we found the impact was negative in magnitude but not statistically significant. In grade 2, we see a positive magnitude, but again, not statistically significant, and these are all at the traditional 5% level. And in grade 3, we essentially see no effect of being assigned to receive intervention services for those students near the eligibility threshold. We acknowledge that the grade 3 state outcome measure that we're using is the state standardized reading achievement test, and this may not be as closely mapped to the skills that are being addressed in interventions, but nonetheless, we do not see an impact there. So we wanted to explore whether there was variation in impacts across our schools. In each of our 3 grades, we had anywhere from 119 to 126 schools that were included in the impact analysis, which included anywhere from 8,000 to 9,200 students. A large sample, certainly relative to prior studies. And in this exploratory analysis, what you see is there is variation that is statistically significant. However, there are not a large number of positive outliers. There are only 4 schools whose positive impacts are significant, meaning that that confidence interval that is shown here by the bar associated with each school does not cross 0. And these dots in the middle of the bar represent the impact estimate, the estimated impact for that school. And so on the grade 1 Eccles K reading assessment, we see this variation, and this pattern of variation looks similar for the outcomes for the other 2 grades as well. So we wanted to investigate whether this variation in impact that we observed was associated with any of the characteristics that we were able to identify in the implementation findings that we described to you earlier. And so we looked at school characteristics, such as whether intervention was provided during or outside the core, whether the school was, and that grade was one that offered at least some intervention services to those students reading at or above as well as below grade level. We looked at other kind of school context factors, such as their baseline achievement scores and general student body composition. And we did not see any consistent patterns across grade levels between these practices and our estimated impacts. We then looked at the student level characteristics and wanted to see whether any of the typical student demographic characteristics one might consider, like race, gender, and age, as well as English learner and IEP status, whether those were associated with the estimated impacts that we found. We did not see any consistent patterns across grade levels. However, we did see a significant negative association between the estimated impact and being over age for grade on the grade 1 Eccles K outcome measure, and to some extent between the estimated impact and the IEP status in grades 1 and grade 3. We don't want to make too much out of this because this is not a consistent pattern across grades. So let's step back for a second, given all the information we've just shared with you, and keep in mind what these results do and do not tell us. These results apply only to those students near the threshold of eligibility for reading interventions. And students near that threshold of eligibility are usually Tier 2, but it does include occasionally some Tier 3 students. So because this is only relevant to those students at that point, all we can take from these results is information about whether to expand or reduce the number of students assigned to intervention services. But this does not tell us whether intervention is effective or ineffective for all students. So these results in particular do not mean that intervention services are ineffective for students at greater risk of reading difficulties, who are usually assigned to receive services in Tier 3. And moreover, the results do not mean that the use of RtI practices or that the framework as a whole is ineffective, because the nature of our impact analysis design, that regression discontinuity approach that uses that cutoff score and the quantitative decision rule as a way to identify students who are similar to each other, only allows us to assess a specific question, which is, what is the impact of assigning students to receive intervention services when they are near that threshold score, not what is the impact of being in a school that is implementing the entire RtI framework. So this study does not evaluate the effectiveness of the RtI framework as a whole. We did not set out to examine the fidelity with which schools implemented the framework, because we, as Ellen said in the beginning, we're looking at schools that were implementing this on their own, meaning they chose the screening assessments they used, they chose the extent of intervention services they provided, and they were making decisions on their time that they were allocating. So that we wanted to sort of see RtI as implemented, what did it look like? In addition, we did not assess the content or effectiveness of specific Tier 2 or 3 reading interventions. And as you can see, our focus was on reading outcomes, so we did not assess the impact of RtI on the identification of students with specific learning disabilities. The regression discontinuity design did not lend itself to that. And unlike smaller scale studies that focus on specific schools and are able to do in-depth observations of instruction or intervention quality, our study at this larger scale was not designed to evaluate that. And so we hope that people keep that in mind when they are looking at our results and sort of thinking about what the takeaway is here. And I'm sure all of this is, as you've been hearing these results of the impact findings, particularly in grade 1, been wondering, so what might explain the negative finding that we saw? So there could be, you can think about this in 2 categories. One might be that there was a problem with the way students were identified. There could have been some sort of false or incorrect identification of students for intervention. And there could be what we have thought of as sort of noise in the screening test, meaning that their level of precision and ability to identify those students who are in need of intervention services might not be that precise. The other problem could be intervention. There might just be some kind of mismatch between the approach or the content of the intervention services that were being delivered and the needs of students near the cut point as it pertains to reading. So, and that could be a function of the student's background characteristics, like whether they're an English learner, or it could represent other types of reading needs that were not being appropriately addressed by the intervention that was being delivered to them. Another possible explanation on the intervention side is that there may have been some poor alignment between the reading intervention and its approach and the core reading instruction that's provided during that core reading block, that core 90-minute reading block. And you might also think about there being a potential opportunity cost of displacing core instruction, whether that be in reading or in other subjects, that was valuable with potentially lower quality intervention. And so we were taking away something that did help and replacing it with something that potentially did not help, or at least was not as helpful. But I think to kind of situate this work in a larger context and breadth of literature, we're going to turn to our experts. And so Russell Gersten will start us off with some initial reflections and comments, and then we'll turn to Carol Connor.
Hi. The title of my comments are Too Much, Too Soon, which is a line some of you may know from the famous Wordsworth poem. And as I kind of been thinking, and most of us have been thinking and brooding about these results for quite a while, that is what strikes me as the key message here. when you look carefully, I know most of us on the study team, and I know the general public in the special ed field is a little perturbed about the negative finding for first graders, that actually, to be specific, the students near the cut point, the kids who were slightly below the benchmark on the commonly used assessments, and it was very often Ames, Webb, or Dibbles, or others were used in our study, that those students actually would have done better if they had not been pulled out for their intervention. So that is a little disturbing, but it's important to remember the earlier finding Reka showed you that 2 out of 5 first graders receive intervention. Now, in the pyramid, the famous pyramid that comes from public health and work in behavior and mental health, the goal was about 20%, 1 in 5 children receive intervention. So right now in practice, and this is why evaluations of what really is happening in the field are critical to do, that double that number are receiving interventions. And for intensive or tier 3 in first grade, it's literally triple the number. Rather than 5%, it's 15%. So it is worth for folks at the state, district, school level to reconsider the decisions that are being made, to start looking at this process. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But the other thing to keep in mind is the caveat, Reka did a beautiful job of presenting that to you. We can't say that the intervention isn't helping most students receiving tier 2 or students receiving tier 3. It's only this group of kids who are really close to the benchmark scores and that the districts did give intervention to. So the too much, it's very likely that there are what we often call false positives, meaning that there are kids who we say is likely to have a reading problem, but they're not really going to have it. And you notice the percents, if you look at the report, go down from grade level to grade level, which is expected because people who've looked carefully at the assessments used for screening have found that they do lead to a lot of false positives. So the idea of looking carefully and considering policies that maybe don't move as fast to catch every kid to make sure he learns or she learns to read is on good track by the first grade, it is backfiring in some way. We don't know exactly how. To put this in perspective, the research this was based on was an extrapolation of a relatively small number of very well-controlled studies. So these would be sometimes studies where people were extensively trained in various reading interventions, monitored carefully. And we all know this is not feasible, affordable, or even necessarily sensible for schools to do. So something got lost in this big scaling up, and we are just beginning to explore what some of the issues are. But it is important to see that RtI, which I believe is the largest case of database decision-making in American education, that there are some issues with the large scale-up, and it was a very rapid scale-up from between Reading First and special ed legislation about 10 years ago. It was a very rapid scale-up. So it is important when we go from small, well-controlled studies to doing things at a national level to be cautious and reflective and to evaluate them as we've begun to do here. And to question this idea of whether it's really useful to catch all kids early. So what I would think practitioners may want to consider, and this will be my wrap-up, is to really look carefully at the psychometric data, the validity data of the screening measures currently in use, including the content of them, and also making sure that the data and the assessments used are up to date, and because sometimes they can be 12 years old, and the world of reading instruction has changed, as have assessments. And the last thought is to rethink this idea, which was pushed broadly based on this fairly small number of studies, some of which do not have significant impacts when you use contemporary statistical techniques, that the standard protocol, the one-size-fits-all for Tier 2, is worth exploring whether it's working. And I could see explorations being as simple and cost-effective as asking teachers, and even if they're older in second, third grade, is this moving too fast or slow for some of the students at the higher end? And I'll leave that for folks to discuss and turn things over to Carol.
Well, thanks so much. You know, I just want to stress the importance of this study and what we've learned from it. You know, we're focusing on the regression discontinuity, but when we think about the rapidity with which schools ramp this up, and if we look at the comparison of the schools that actually were implementing at least a certain model of RTI with those who are randomly selected, we do see that schools are starting to implement RTI. And I think that the widespread use of this kind of data-based decision-making is really encouraging. And so while there are aspects of this that make us scratch our head, there are other parts to be really excited about. And, you know, the purpose of doing these kinds of studies is to think about what do we need to learn more. And the next one I want to go, so I want to think about one of our first challenges, as Russ said, and as I think is clear from the regression discontinuity. There are real challenges in identifying children for Tier 2. Rika, will you go to my next slide, please? Mm-hmm. Yep. So if you look at this grant, oops, I'm missing 2 bars. Are they, oh, maybe, oh, there we go. Good. Mm-hmm. I got too fancy for my own good. Go ahead and just put them all up. So what we have in this graph is on the vertical axis is the recommended minutes per day of small group teacher-managed code-focused instruction. This is what many of the standardized interventions, standard protocol interventions used in the RTI schools. Along the horizontal axis are the children's actual reading scores based on strong letter word reading or decoding evaluation. And if you look at, this is first grade, this function came directly out of research, showing that as children fall farther below grade level at the beginning of first grade, so that dotted line is grade level, they need exponentially more. And so let's say a school has decided, okay, kids who are reading half a grade level behind where we expect them to be, they should be in Tier 2. One of the things you'll notice about the blue line that's on either side of that solid line is that, guess what? They don't need that different amount, right? That, in fact, reading is a continuous variable. And the kids to the left of the red line don't need a whole lot more than the kids who are reading just right of the red line. And so one of the things we want to think about is rather than these benchmark cutoffs, we want to be thinking perhaps about a more graduated cutoff. And this just shows how very difficult these decisions are. There's also research to suggest that which test you use really matters, and I think Russ's comments about what kind of assessments we're using to screen these kids is really important. The next point I want to make is matching interventions to students' learning needs. And again, this is where data can be very helpful, but if all teachers have is a reading fluency test, then they're not going to have enough information to really think about matching interventions to students' learning needs. And I'm going to use English learners as an example. They're frequently not bad at decoding, right? They can decode words. The dilemma, of course, is because English is a second language to them, they may not have the vocabulary and English language skills they need to actually understand what it is they're reading. And so part of thinking about Tier 2 and Tier 3 is really matching what are the children's learning needs and how can we provide more optimal opportunities for them to learn about, to improve their reading skills. And then my last point is, you know, let's think about how important general education classroom instruction is. And, you know, Rika was talking a little bit about opportunity costs. So, you know, if you have a first grade teacher or second or third grade teacher or a kindergarten teacher who's doing small group instruction as part of her Tier 1, where the kids are doing really well, are getting challenging opportunities to learn, and the little guys who really need more explicit code-focused or meaning-focused instruction are getting that, then why would you want to pull kids out for Tier 2, right? If we can differentiate Tier 1 effectively, then we can push down the thought of referral to Tier 2 and Tier 3 to those kids who really need all of effective Tier 1 instruction. And then think about really tailoring Tier 2 and Tier 3 for those children most in need. And I think the regression discontinuity results might be speaking to this, is that we're actually pulling kids out of what seems to be pretty effective instruction and not individualizing the Tier 2 well enough to meet their needs. And I'm going to stop right there because I want to make sure there's time for lots and lots of questions.
So we'll take questions now. If you can, if your chat function is not working, what I would ask is that you send an email to rtiproject@mdrc.org, and we can answer questions in turn. So I know that they're hit, and we're happy to go back to show earlier slides as well. So in fact, I might just go back to this set of possible explanations, which I know people want to mull over a bit. So one of the questions that came up that Russell made reference to, that I'll just clarify while we're waiting for questions to be sent in, is schools used a variety of different screening assessments. In this study, nothing was prescribed, so schools were using Dibbles, Ames Web, other things that are considered kind of widely and commercially available to use to screen students at the beginning of the semesters. And schools also used a variety of curricula and interventions. Again, nothing was prescribed in this study. So there was a fair bit of variety across schools in our sample. We think that that variety in screening assessments that were used and the cut scores or decision rules that schools selected for each of their grades allows us to capture something about representative about what's current school practices and gives the findings a little more generalizability than if this were just about one very well specified curriculum or one particular cut point. But I just wanted to clarify that there was that natural variation there. There are other questions that people had about the design, about any of the findings we presented. If you have a question, just send an email to rtiproject@mdrc.org. Because it seems like some people are having trouble with the chat function, going to reliable email is the best thing. Yeah, and you can also just email us to say you'd like to be unmuted if you'd rather just ask your question verbally. But if we unmute everybody, there's just a lot of background noise that makes it difficult to hear. Ellen, were there any follow-up points you wanted to make while we're waiting for questions to come in?
Sure. I think, you know, one point that you've made, and I just want to reiterate, is that the schools were screened for the use of RTI practices as a framework, use of multiple tiers, screening at least twice a year, use of database decision rules, the way in which, or the fact that they included Core 1 and Core Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions in an increasing intensity. And it's important to recognize that, you know, they were screened for these practices, but it wasn't any specific practice or use of a specific tool or specific intervention that was examined as having an influence on student outcomes. The advantage of that is, I think, as Carol was indicating, this is an opportunity to look at practice in use by experienced schools. And that data obviously is available in the report and will also be available through a secondary data set once it's released.
Yes, and I'll also just remind us that this webinar and the slides will be posted after this event along sometime soon with a kind of frequently asked questions document. So if you have a question that occurs to you maybe after our seminar today that you'd like to send in, we can add that to our list of frequently asked questions and provide responses there that will then be available for your reference along with the presentation we've already made. Well, we tried to keep our presentation brief to keep plenty of time open for questions, but it may be that you're mulling over some of the findings we presented and might have questions later, and please feel free to send them as and when they occur to you. I think I just want to say that this study could not have happened without the participation and efforts of very many people and contributors, and we'd really like to thank IES for supporting this effort. John, is there anything you'd like to say as concluding remarks?
This is John Jacobson, the project officer at IES. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So we certainly appreciate all of the interest in this study, the discussion of the findings. We appreciate all the effort that MDRC and SRI, IRG, and their partners and consultants put into designing the study and implementing it and now in interpreting it. And we hope the study is useful for informing the improvement of the reading programs that schools and districts have, and we certainly realize that this study needs to be understood in context of a large number of studies that are done both on smaller scale but also larger scale evaluations. So we look forward to receiving comments, and we certainly hope that those comments can inform where research and evaluation goes in the future.
Great. Well, one last call for questions. Otherwise, with that, we can conclude. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your time and interest, and we hope to continue the dialogue going. And as part of that, any of the study authors are available for smaller briefings or presentations. So if you would like us to come and do more of a tailored presentation or conversation for your organization or to your members, please feel free to reach out to us. And again, the RTI project at mdrc.org email is the best place to reach us. Great. Well, thank you all very much. Have a good day.